Welcome classic rock fans to another episode of New Album Review. And for today's episode I'd like to talk about the new Paul Weller album, True Meanings. The album's own press release has described it as, and I'm quoting, an album characterised by grandiose yet delicate lush orchestration, a dreamy, peaceful, pastoral set of songs to get lost in. And indeed it certainly is. To quote from one of the songs on the album, it's an album in which to find true meanings and patterns in things. It feels like Weller's kind of own sort of personal quest. A quest, of course, that began probably a few months ago in his own Black Barn studio. Paul Weller's solo stuff can certainly be described as eclectic, and this album doesn't disappoint in that respect. I mean, he always seems to incorporate kind of a free-spirited jazz rock, blended beautifully with sort of a soul psychedelia, all sort of merging together. But this album is very acoustic, has a very folky sort of sensibility to it. In fact, listening to it, you want to immediately reach for your clay pipe and moccasins and perhaps dust off your copy of The Hangman's Beautiful Daughter. It certainly has that sort of vibe to it. For many, of course, this will seem like a far cry from the Angry Young Man of the Jam, but then I think to compare Paul Weller's recent stuff, or a lot of his solo stuff, with what he did with the Jam, well, it's just plain silly, isn't it? And this album is certainly much more mellow than that. In fact, NME have described it as this is Paul Weller's Nebraska. I mean, if you were to compare it to Bruce Springsteen's Nebraska, you could argue that the instrumentation and the scope is perhaps similar. However, I think the topography of this album is certainly not as bleak as Springsteen's album. However, unlike Nebraska, this album has a more sort of bucolic feel to, almost a campfire feel to it. It's lots of natural imagery is evoked. For example, references to winds blowing, tides flowing under blue or evening skies. It's certainly, as it says in its blurb, it's a pastoral work sort of that balances the sort of lovely sound of sort of folky guitars, orchestral arrangements, as well as kind of honeyed or sort of mellifluous sort of horn sections. But this is not the first time that Weller's kind of dabbled with that kind of sort of folky, almost pastoral sort of sensibility. Those of us old enough will remember the Jam's English Rose, not to mention Paul Weller's own solo album, Wildwood. But I don't think he's ever plunged as wholeheartedly into the kind of hand-knitted Fair Isle sweater territory which he does on this album. Of course, not all the critics have been particularly flattering about this album. NME have said True Meanings tends to blend into a lilting mush over the course of 14 tracks that rarely stray from the beige end of the sonic palette. I disagree with NME on this. I think this is an immensely beautiful album. It's a mature work, undoubtedly, and it's kind of like it has an immense beauty that kind of builds like a sort of a layered oil painting. I love Weller's voice on this album. It's slightly hoarser, more weathered, I think, but nevertheless it's still quite powerful and certainly distinctive. It's kind of gentle, modulated tones presents sort of crooning at its best, I think somebody wrote. In fact, somebody has said that the voice and guitar on this album recall Nick Drake's work with Robert Kirby. High praise indeed. But nevertheless, I think his singing... I think in many respects he's a far more accomplished vocalist now, of course, than he was 30 or 40 years ago. If you think about the songs on this album, the first song that kicks it all off, of course, is The Soul Searchers. Lovely sort of tumbling guitar and a beautiful sort of psychedelic swirling organ sound provided by Rod Argent. The instrumentation itself provides a wonderful platform for a song that seems to be ultimately about the search for some cosmic truth. The musicianship and the orchestrations on this album are just absolutely remarkable, I think. You get that kind of usual sort of Weller-esque, I don't know if that's an adjective, it is now, Paul Weller obligatory nods to sort of R&B and those sort of soul sensibilities, especially on the song Mayfly. But I also love the jazz-tinged affectations we get on the song Old Castles, which has an almost sort of style council vibe to it. You just find yourself wanting to listen to it again and again. It's quite infectious, if I can use that word. If we think about the other songs on the album, we get sort of Moving On, of course, which is a vivid and lush depiction of a sunset. It almost It's almost described in terms of an oil painting, to use that metaphor again. And of course Bowie, of course, which has been described by NME as a moving and well-deserved tribute to the late Zigster. And we get the song White Horses, which has Rod Argent playing mellotron on it, of all things, which gives it immediately a kind of cosmic awesomeness. This album certainly has kind of a dreamy, sort of melancholic feel to it. Listening to it, you immediately want to use adjectives like immersive, wistful, autumnal even. Especially with songs like Wishing Well, which is very reminiscent of sort of Neil Young, sort of after the Gold Rush harvest period. And there are numerous guests that show up on this album. Of course, there's Lucy Rose and folk giant Mark McCarthy, of course, who add a beauty and a grace to the proceedings. Rather predictably, of course, Noel Gallagher shows up and he plays piano or harmonium on it, I can't remember which. But nevertheless, it's interesting. It all adds some rather, it sounds rather oxymoronic, but rather sort of colourful shades to the album. In fact, one critic has written, these aren't Weller's greatest songs, but they're certainly his loveliest, and I certainly agree. Overall, I think this is a very, very good album. It won't occupy my sort of a Paul Weller trilogy of greatness, my holy trinity, that is Stanley Road, Wildwood and Heavy Soul, but it will certainly be an album that will take pride of place in my collection. To kind of sum up, I'd like to leave you with a quote from the latest edition of New Musical Express. True Meanings is a reflective, acoustic-led chill zone, all moonbeams, wheat fields, twilight and unfolding memories. Indeed it is. Anyway, thank you for watching. You've been watching an episode of New Album Review. Please click like, subscribe, share this video, check out the Facebook page, but more importantly, please do keep listening.